Hello and welcome to the Unapologetic Moms Club. I'm your host, Janine McKinnon, and we're here to break down taboos together around things like sex, relationships, cannabis, finances, women's health, mom life, and everything in between. You'll find a welcoming community full of like-minded moms, unconventional resources, out-of-the-box ideas, and all of the facts and information you're craving on various topics from vetted, credible experts. Each week we explore a new topic, and you'll finish with tangible takeaways to apply the information to your unique lifestyle. Let's get started. Hello and welcome to another episode inside the Unapologetic Moms Club. I am excited to welcome back Danielle Simone Brand to talk all about mushrooms for wellness. So thank you for coming back and chatting with us.
Yeah, thanks, Janine. I'm stoked to be here. Love this topic.
Yeah, and it's a fun topic, and you're so knowledgeable. For listeners, if you haven't already checked out our previous episode, Implications of Being a Canna Mom, Danielle shares a lot of her knowledge in cannabis and motherhood. So you can check out that episode too. All right, mushrooms and wellness. What are we talking about here?
Yeah, there's so much to talk about, but, we wanted to cover microdosing, right? Which is having a moment. It's hot right now. There's a lot more interest and articles and, even products being marketed around this. And I think it's a really rich area for moms, just like I think cannabis is a really rich area for moms to explore. But, because moms have particular considerations, obviously, around safety and, just being responsible for other humans. I think that, there's some specific things that are great to talk about when it comes to moms experimenting with these different plant medicines.
Absolutely. It's been interesting to see mushrooms gaining more popularity and more interest over the last few years, as I saw happen with cannabis kind of beforehand. And I know it really started hitting more mainstream when my stepdad had mentioned having a little bit of an interest in kind of the medical benefits that can come from them.
For sure. I mean, I think that, research we can get into the research if you want to in a little bit, but it's really ramping up around psychedelics in general, and, including psilocybin. And I think it's just such a fascinating moment where we're learning more about how they work, about, how they work in the brain. Of course, there's thousands of years of experience and anecdotal evidence that we have about mushrooms too. But, now we're kind of starting to get into the whole, double-blind, placebo-controlled studies about how this really works, right?
Absolutely. And again, similar to cannabis, where it was before kind of that idea of hippies, partiers going all crazy on mushrooms, but it really can be a tool for wellness and mental health. There's been a lot of studies with people with depression and cancer and things like that too, that have seen a lot of benefits with mushrooms.
Yeah, that's for sure. I think, that's a really fascinating area of the research right now. There's, a lot of stuff about end of life anxiety that has been, significantly ameliorated with the use of magic mushrooms, psilocybin, let's say. And then, a whole slew of other things. And it's basically mostly related to mental health. We're talking about, anxiety, depression, PTSD, feelings of openness and empathy. All of these, at least we're getting the sense through research that these are improved with the use of psychedelics. Much of the research, I should say, has been done on macrodoses, the big doses of mushrooms. So in the, 2 gram to 5 gram range, which is quite a bit more than we would use for microdosing. But there is some interesting research starting to come out about microdosing, and just a lot of, like I was saying, anecdotal evidence, people reporting from their own usage, putting it on the internet, contributing to surveys. These things are not, necessarily gold standard scientific research, but they do account for something. Lots of people are using these in really beneficial ways.
Absolutely. So let's start with some of the history. And are we talking just psilocybin, or are there other types as well? Let's hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, psilocybin cubensis is the most common let's see, the most common psychoactive ingredient in what we would call magic mushrooms. There are other psychoactive magic mushroom strains and ingredients. We're mainly focusing, let's just focus on psilocybin today because that's the one that most people are familiar with. It's the really most common one. So psilocybin cubensis is a broad term for a bunch of different mushrooms, and lots of, just like with cannabis, we have different strains. There are many different strains within psilocybin cubensis that people use. So if you've heard of like golden teachers or B plus or Amazonian or Treasure Coast or the fun penis envy,
all the fun names, just like with cannabis, right?
Totally. I mean, penis envy literally is very phallic shaped. But these are all different strains that contain psilocybin. And psilocybin is the prodrug actually that the body converts to psilocin, which is the one that activates, these psychedelic effects or subperceptual psychedelic effects if we're talking about microdosing.
Interesting. So would you say it's similar to like psilocybin with like THC, how it's kind of the main popular one that most people know about, but there is like CBD, CBG, and all those sort of things? Would you say that's somewhat of a similar parallel to mushrooms, to give some context, or to psilocybin?
Yeah, I would say somewhat of a similar one. There are others, like I said, other psychoactive compounds in different strains of mushrooms that just aren't as common, that we just don't know as much. Also, similar to cannabis, there may be an entourage effect with mushrooms, so that we're not just talking about the psilocybin that converts to psilocin itself, but the other sort of plant components that might, boost or potentiate the effects. So just like, a synthesized THC molecule may not be as effective as taking whole plant medicine. Same thing with mushrooms, just psilocybin isolated might not be as effective as like the whole mushroom with all its, wonderful compounds.
Exactly. That's what's so wonderful about plant medicine. And we could be taking, say, certain supplements that have vitamin C or different things, but we might see much better benefits if we're eating the whole food that contains all of the different complementary vitamins and things like that.
Exactly. Yep. There's definitely a whole plant sort of deal, and something that I always promote is, whole foods, whole plant medicines, utilize all the compounds that really are there to work synergistically with our bodies.
Absolutely. So let's hear a little bit about the history. Like you mentioned, people have been using psilocybin for thousands of years in many different religions and riterals and things like that.
Absolutely. So here's an interesting theory. This is a hypothesis. It's definitely not been proven yet, but Terence McKenna, who is, you probably have heard of him, the really well-known psychedelics advocate and researcher. He's passed now. He came up with this idea called the stoned ape hypothesis. that way back in our human evolution, right? What he postulates that what kind of helped transform us or usher us from being like an advanced hominid, an animal like so many others on the plains out there, to being human beings with consciousness and the ability to plan and to create all these systems that we have, was the introduction of psilocybin into our diets through mushrooms. He says that it actually helped create neural networks and, neurogenesis that stimulated our creativity, our empathy, our, just ability to just be human and create the things that we have. So fascinating. There is some evidence that really, really early cultures did harvest psilocybin for various purposes, including in the yogic traditions. There may be some references to psilocybin and other psychedelics that helped people with their ritual, practices, help them communicate with their higher self or a spirit or God, however they, visualize that, however they, imagined that. So, and yes, we have accounts from various cultures all over the world that, for many, many hundreds, if not thousands of years, were utilizing these plant medicines.
Absolutely. It's really interesting to hear that hypothesis. I have heard it before, but it does make sense how these things do somewhat just kind of unlock these other feelings or ways of thinking or even visualizations with the more macro doses. So I could see that. That's really interesting.
It is. And, research now is showing that neurogenesis, like the ability to sort of create new networks in our brains is boosted or, potentiated by some of these substances. So high doses of psilocybin, high doses of LSD are shown to help create these new neural networks. And, that we theorize leads to greater creativity, greater, connection forming, thinking outside the box, things that, we humans are pretty good at, actually.
Oh, neat. So there's actually studies that have shown the scientific backing for these new neural connections.
There is, and it's still preliminary, and it's not solid when it comes to microdosing necessarily, that microdosing does the same thing, although many people who microdose think that it does. It sort of pushes that in smaller ways or more, subtle ways, given that the dose is much smaller.
Interesting. And I recently recorded an episode on manifesting that's actually coming out tomorrow at the time of this recording. And we had touched on the neurolinguistic programming and how you're really rewiring your brain. And so you might have these certain limiting beliefs, unconscious thoughts that are kind of holding you back. And you need to take the time to actually reprogram your thoughts through these different practices. And so with what you're saying, it almost sounds like mushroom psilocybin could potentially be a tool for different kinds of reprogramming.
I think that it could. I mean, I can't make that
this
claim
is all
as a
anecdotal,
scientist.
absolutely.
But I do. I mean, and that's, I think that's why we see in these research studies with higher doses of psychedelics, when people are deliberately taking them in order to, dive deep and deal with these, buried thoughts, feelings, patterns, neural patterns that we have, and they're working with a therapist and they're doing it in a very intentional way. I think that, that's why we're seeing such dramatic results from these studies with larger doses, because the psilocybin sort of allows you to kind of get deeper and really get in there and maybe form some new connections and get out of that depression rut or that anxiety rut and, let the brain just form new pathways.
Absolutely. I think it's important to note what you touched on is we're not just talking about people going out and trying a bunch of psychedelics. It is being controlled and responsible. As you said, a lot of these studies, it's in conjunction with a therapist and with doing the actual work.
Absolutely. Yeah. These studies are in, a clinical setting, but, they make it homey in their clinical setting. So people have a couch and they've got music and they've got eye shades and they've got, soothing colors and things like that. And they're working with therapists who are specifically trained to help people really go deep, really get into, what's holding them back. So it is pretty fascinating. And yes, absolutely. I am an advocate of experimenting cautiously, responsibly, mindfully on one's own with smaller doses. Definitely.
Yeah. So let's talk about doses. You touched on microdose, macrodose. So what are these actual dosage amounts?
Yeah. Okay. So it does vary because, for a bunch of reasons. One is different strains of mushrooms might have different potencies. So unless you're actually able to lab test them, which we really don't have the capacity to do right now, take it with a grain of salt. But generally speaking, somewhere between 1 gram and 5 grams of dried mushroom material is considered a full dose. So on the low side of that, it will be, a more subtle full dose or full trip. And on the 5 gram side of that, that's considered a heroic dose, something that I would never recommend to a beginner. Right. That's about, really, again, going deep. That's where a lot of people, or not a lot, but some people experience what's called ego death, right? That sense of just dissolution of the individual self, oneness, emerging, that sense of oneness emerging with all living and non-living things. And that can be a very profound, beautiful experience, but also extremely intense. So that's what we're talking about on the high sides of things. So if you're going to say that a full dose or regular dose is around 2 grams, let's say, or 2.5 grams for someone who's not, trying to push that envelope really far, then a microdose is 1/10 to 1/20 of that. So
Okay.
yeah, we're getting down really low to like zero point 0.1 to zero point 0.5 ish grams would be the microdosing range for psilocybin. And I always recommend just starting on the lowest side, just see how it affects you. Start low and go slow, just like cannabis is our
I was just going to say
motto.
that.
Yeah. And what we're looking for, let me just say what we're looking for with a microdose is a subtle, in some cases, not even perceptible change, but for some people, there is a little bit of that altered state. But we're looking for an altered state that still allows you to engage, to work, if that's what's on the agenda for the day, to be with the people that you're with. And if you go, over that microdose, you might get into that place where it's a little uncomfortable to do those things. So that's why, we want to stay in a place where it's either sub-perceptual or just really subtly perceptual.
Absolutely. So how do we consume the dried mushrooms? Is it just straight up eating a dried mushroom? Or are there different ways or teas? I actually saw someone sprinkling what looked like it was almost ground up or chopped very finely and sprinkling it on their toast. Although I feel like that wouldn't taste very good. I do have experience taking mushrooms in my younger days and it does not taste good.
It doesn't taste great. It's very earthy.
Yes.
Sure. So if you're only having a microdose, then you don't notice much of the flavor because it's just not enough material to make it that strong. So many people, what they do is, like you mentioned, if they grow their own mushrooms or if they receive mushrooms, they'll pound, grind it up basically with a mortar and pestle or even a coffee grinder, something like that, to a fairly fine powder. And then if you can measure it, it is better if you have a really sensitive scale, because then you know what you're getting. Of course, a lot of people eyeball it, but I do recommend weighing. So you may measure out the amount of the powder, basically, mushroom powder, and you can either put it in your morning coffee or tea or water or sprinkle it on your toast, I suppose. I think a liquid is better because there's so little of the amount in it. There's so little actual powder in it that you want to kind of wash it down and not have it stuck in your esophagus or whatever, these tiny little pieces. You want to actually get the benefits. Some people will also just put it in a capsule. So they'll pre-measure their own and put it in a little capsule. It won't fill the capsule. It will just be, just like the tiniest amount. And then I know that there are products available too now. There are microdosing products, and I've seen some in the Canadian market actually, but they're not legal per se. They are unregulated, but it seems like not enforced in terms of, its illegality at this point. Okay. Yeah. What is your experience in Canada? Have you seen products?
So I was going to lead into that question is I've been seeing more dispensaries when I was doing a bunch of research on dispensaries, more and more also offering psilocybin and mushroom products, which I was quite surprised to research them and Google, check out the dispensary, and it's right there with their list of products. So it's not being hidden at all. I'm sure some are probably being a little bit more closed with it, but there are many places throughout Canada that are online advertising that they carry and sell it.
That is so interesting. So, I mean, as far as I know, that is a gray area. It's not technically supposed to be sold, but but I find that quite interesting. I am definitely for greater access, as long as people have education on how to use it properly. And I also read that spore kits are pretty readily available in Canada too for growing your own, even though, the kit itself would be legal, but creating psilocybin from it would be illegal technically. Okay. And that's often how people here in the States do it. They're able to get the spores and then they're able to, just get the grow material often from two different places. And it's legal to possess each of them. It's just not legal to put them together and try to grow it. But, people do.
Yeah. It's interesting where those lines are drawn for what's legal and what's not legal. So how do the spore kits and growing your own mushrooms, how does that all work?
It's a bit of a process. It takes some time. It takes about 6 weeks usually, not of continuous care or anything, but there is, there are some processes. So usually, yeah, people buy a growing medium online. It's often like a tub, a big plastic tub that has a humidifier and a temperature control and a light and a material for the mushrooms to grow on, sort of a substrate material. And then you get the spores from somewhere else, and you have these glass jars, these small glass jars that have growing material inside them. You take the spore that comes in like a syringe, basically like a plastic syringe, and you inject it in there. So the spores are inoculated. You put them, and there's like sterilization processes and stuff like that. So it's a little bit of a process, but it is accessible for people who are interested. If you want to do a science experiment at home, it is a super interesting process. So anyway, after that, they have to sort of start germinating. It's not germinating, but they have to start growing. And then, you kind of usher them through, you feed them a little bit. And yeah, about 6 weeks later, if all goes well, you get a harvest. And I'll just give you an example. I did this 2.5 years ago for myself, and I still have some of my harvest from that time. So, and wow. I do microdose regularly. So I was able to go through that somewhat lengthy process, but really have like 2+ years supply.
Oh, wow.
So it's something that
it's quite the yield.
It is. If people are interested in that grow process, again, a little bit of a learning curve, but it is worth it because it's economical and you can really, supply your own.
Mm-hmm. So substrate material, are we talking like dirt, like some sort of dirt? And then what exactly are the spores? Is that like little bits of mushroom, or what exactly is that?
Well, spores are given off by the mushrooms. Like when you see them out in nature, like the fruiting body is what you see above ground. The mycelium is this network that goes below ground that connects, mushrooms with all the other mushrooms and the rest of the ecosystem. It's super cool. But the fruiting body is the actual mushroom itself, and it gives off spores. So basically just, I'm not a botanist, but like babies, like, tiny.
It's essentially like the mushroom's version of seeds.
Exactly.
But it's like a spore kind of thing that's released.
Exactly. And so the spores can be collected and, concentrated, and that's what you can buy in the spore kit online. It's a liquid. It's a little liquid that, just the tiniest amount will inoculate a jar about, that big. And so I probably did 12 of those, something like that. And, with one syringe of spore, and was able to get that much of a harvest. So
wow,
it's a really cool thing.
Mm-hmm. I'm really curious about this. And I like gardening and like growing different things. And we started growing our own cannabis plants last year.
Nice.
And so this might be something fun to just kind of play around with.
Yeah, I think it is. And, obviously you want to be, mindful and responsible that kids don't access them.
Oh, absolutely.
But, I still think it's interesting for kids to see them growing. I don't think that that's a taboo. Like it's a plant. It grows out in nature, Yeah. And it's pretty cool to watch that process. So that's something that kids can enjoy.
Now, you touched on a little bit about like the mushroom network, and this is outside the scope of the episode that we had talked about, but it reminded me of there's this new tourist thing here in Greater Victoria. It's called the Skywalk. And so it's in the forest. They've built this beautiful wooden trail, and there's this big tall tower. But throughout that, they have different informational plaques as you walk through it. And one of them was talking about mushrooms. And you just reminded me of this. And I found it so interesting that they mentioned how mushrooms throughout a forest, actually underground, they talk to each other. Do you know much about that?
Just a little bit. Have you seen the Netflix documentary, Fantastic Fungi?
No, but now I'm going to.
It talks about that phenomenon a lot, and it's really fascinating. The mycelium is the underground network of the mushrooms, and it's sort of like this these filaments almost that connect mushroom species to other mushroom species. But we're learning that apparently through this mycelium, mushrooms can communicate with the whole ecosystem and like help distribute nutrients from one part of the ecosystem to another part of the ecosystem, like from one tree to another tree through the mycelial network. I mean, I'm not I'm not a scientist, but I find that so fascinating and, like almost unbelievable. Like how do they do this,
Yeah, it's so interesting. And it kind of goes back to like that oneness and how these things do communicate through the whole ecosystem and help all of these different plants and things like that. And it kind of parallels that oneness and that feeling of connectedness with earth and nature that many people experience with mushrooms. It's interesting.
Exactly. I think you said that really well. The fact that, many people who have learned spiritually from mushrooms do cite their like actual physical nature as an inspiration. I mean, I'll just like super anecdotally, one time I did take a larger dose of my homegrown mushrooms, mostly I microdosed, but my kids were not here for a couple of weeks. They're with their grandparents, and I had a little bit of free time, so I decided to take a macro dose. And one of the most impactful things of that time period was literally just being in my outdoor space, being in my yard, and picking up dirt and soil and like it sounds so silly and simple, but looking at all the components of soil, it is made up of everything. It's made up of little bits of leaves and little bits of other decomposed plants and tiny rocks and and the dead bugs and like just I became fascinated with the interconnection of all things, which is a very common experience with mushrooms. But through that connection to nature, through that that the mushrooms really highlighted connection for me, just as you said.
Yeah, that's so neat. I'm like getting way more interested in this than I had originally thought I would be. So let's talk about side effects. We actually, in one of our recent Club Hangouts, one member had mentioned how they played around and had some fun with a friend with more of a macro dose, and they experienced a different kind of hangover. That seem to affect their moods for a few days. So what can you share with us about different side effects and other things we need to keep in mind?
Yeah. So the downsides, I think, well, actually, let's talk just a little bit more about the upsides. And
let's go full-blown benefits, and then we can go full-blown other side effects and things like that.
Awesome. Okay. So, not 100% substantiated by research yet, but according to anecdotal reports of people who were doing this, psilocybin helps, especially microdosing helps them increase their absorption, their deep focus on the present moment. It helps. Many people say it helps with depression, anxiety, PTSD, addiction issues. It's been actually studied at macro doses for smoking cessation and alcohol cessation. So that's another thing. And pain management. Also,
pain management too. I was unaware of that. Interesting.
Yeah, which is a little more, less researched, a little more fringe at this point, but it's a possibility. Yeah, some people are using it that way. And then many people find that they can access that flow state a little more easily with psilocybin. So just, that sense where like we're really absorbed in what we're doing, time passes in a different way. Often, it feels like it flew by when we're super engrossed in something. That sense of just like creative flow and movement and sustained energy. So those are some of the benefits reported. And I think some of the downsides, well, first of all, if you take too much, if you intend to take a microdose and you take too much, then you probably won't be able to do what you plan to do that day. So whether that's working or, parenting solo or whatever it is. I think that's the main thing is just be really, really aware of your dosage. It can also amplify emotions. People say this, and I experienced it too. So that can be a really good thing, I think, when we are looking to notice our triggers, process our triggers, be really intentional with it. But on a day, for me, for instance, on a day when I have to switch gears a lot between work and kids and back and forth and brain this, here and there, it doesn't work as well for me. And I feel more impatient, more annoyed with my family and with my work and everything because of that sense of amplification and that sense of like, wow, this is a little more intense for me. And that tends to be with a microdose that's like on the higher side. Like a low side microdose probably wouldn't have the same effect. So again, super, super dose dependent. And then, if you are taking any medications, you should definitely talk to, a doctor who's knowledgeable about psilocybin, not a prohibitionist who's just going to be like, what are you talking about? No way. But, someone who is actually knowledgeable and thoughtful about it. There are certain medications, including psychiatric medications, that you probably don't want to microdose or macrodose, or maybe one microdose would be fine, but microdosing long-term might not be a good idea. So yeah, you want to talk to your doctor if you're on medications. And some people may have some sensitivity to developing heart valve issues with long-term microdosing. So yeah, so that's also something to be aware of, that, it's something that you should, speak to someone who's knowledgeable about it if you have any conditions that you're being medicated for or currently treating. Just like fen-phen several years ago, like 25 years ago, whenever that was taken off the market because it can cause a heart valve issue in long-term use. It's that same mechanism that might actually be affected by psilocybin.
Okay. Yeah. As with anything, if there's any health concerns, it's always best to speak with your medical practitioner.
Definitely. And then, in terms of just sort of harm reduction and, good practices, I think for parents, especially for moms, set and setting is super important. Even if you're not going on a full blown trip and a full, heroic journey or anything like that, still, thinking about why am I taking this substance? What am I seeking from it? What do I hope to, learn or embody or whatever it is? Being intentional is great. Start low and go slow, as we said. And then I do recommend the first time microdosing psilocybin, just make it a day where you don't have a lot of expectations or responsibilities. And I know for parents, like, when is that?
Yeah.
Especially if you've got, young kids at home. But, I recommend on a day where you don't have to drive or, be the solo parent or, show up for a presentation or something at work.
Absolutely. Yeah. We need to use our responsible common sense, especially when you don't fully know what's going to happen while you're still doing some experimentation and unsure of how it's going to affect you.
Exactly. And like I said, certain medications could interfere. So you want to be careful about that. And also it's a good idea, I think, to start early in the day. If you're going to microdose, it tends to be a bit stimulating. And people say that if they take it in the afternoon, they might have trouble sleeping that night. And microdoses are not known to cause a hangover. But, certainly you can feel residual effects from a big dose.
Okay. So let's go over kind of the feelings that we may go through. I'm also curious about onset. Like I know with cannabis, smoking, it's an immediate kind of onset that will kind of peak in a shorter amount of time compared to edibles, where it's a much slower onset and lasts a lot longer. So what does that look like with psilocybin?
Similarly, so since we have to digest it, it does take longer to come on. So, probably 30 minutes at the minimum, but probably more like an hour for many people for that. If you take a large enough microdose, you might even feel what's called a come up in the psychedelics lingo. A come up is like when you start feeling the effects of the substance and it starts, maybe intensifying. But again, with a very small microdose, you're unlikely to ever feel like, oh, it's kicking in. You might just notice a few hours later that you feel in your flow, or you feel chill, or you feel, like less anxious or depressed, things like that. And yeah, like I said, a lot of people feel that sense of increased absorption, focus on their task. That does tend to be the case for me. But I can also get focused on the wrong thing if I haven't, been intentional about, okay, this is the project that I'm working on right now when I'm feeling the effects of this microdose. And at last, I would say that the more, if you took a perceptual dose, that perceptual feeling will last for about 4 to 6 hours. But I should say that some people report second day after microdosing to have their best effect. And interestingly, because it's no longer really active, right? The drug is no longer really active in your system, but perhaps the neurogenesis that it, brings about, the, increased brain connection, neuronal connections and things like that, might be contributing to that second day feeling of like flow and ease. And we can talk about protocols, actually, microdosing protocols, because one of them includes only microdosing every 4 days so that you can really feel those effects on the days after.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Yeah. So let's dig into those protocols.
Sure. All right. So the two most common ones out there right now on the psychedelics world are the Fadiman protocol and the Stamets protocol. So Fadiman is named after James Fadiman, Fadiman. And if you look up his work online, you'll see a lot of articles written by and about him. And he's done a lot of, he's a psychedelics advocate and also a qualitative researcher. So, I'm not going to say super scientific necessarily, but has collected a lot of reports of people's microdosing experiences. And based on, years of qualitative research, he recommends this protocol. On day 1, you microdose. On day 2, you don't. And many people, like I said, feel the sort of flow and increased sense of openness and empathy even greater that second day. And then the third day is just a reset. Like, you don't microdose, you probably won't feel the effects of the microdose. And it's about just sort of resetting your tolerance and noticing what normal is for you. And then the fourth day, it's microdosing again. So that cycle, repeats. Okay. And some people do that for about 30 days. So maybe 10-ish or 9-ish cycles or whatever, until they want to take a little break, just kind of see how the microdosing has affected them in the long term. It's always great to, take notes, keep a journal, just like with cannabis. So that's that one. That's the Fadiman protocol. And I have tried that, and a lot of people have, and you can even submit your reports of how it goes for you to contribute to that research at the Fadiman site. Yeah.
Nice. And we'll link that too. So listeners can look at his different research.
Awesome. And then the Stamets protocol is another one. And Paul Stamets is an American mycologist who had a very dramatic first experience with mushrooms that he talks about in many of his, speeches, and he might have done a TED Talk and things like that, where as a youth, he struggled with stuttering like really intensely, such that he had a hard time making friends and had a hard time in school. And it really impacted his life. And with a macrodose of psilocybin, he had this really, really intense experience. I think he was even he climbed a tree and was clinging onto the tree in a storm. I mean, very, very intense experience while under this severe, this high dose. And at the end of that trip, he didn't stutter again.
Wow.
He was healed of that. It's incredible. And, it changed his life. And so he really delved into the study of mushrooms and has, companies and educational programs and all that now. So what he recommends is 4 days on, 3 days off. So 4 days of microdosing and then 3-day break. So that will take a week. And then obviously you can start again the next week. He also recommends stacking it with, so it'll be the psilocybin, the microdose of psilocybin, lion's mane mushroom, which is, I'm sure you've heard of that. It's a medicinal mushroom. It's totally legal, not illegal. You can find it in natural foods and supplement stores, and it has been researched for cognition and memory support. And he believes that it helps sort of just increase the positive brain effects of psilocybin. And then the third thing he recommends to stack it with is vitamin B3 niacin. Yeah. And niacin, if you take the variety called, there's a non-flushing variety and then a regular variety. You want to take the flushing variety because what it does is it actually increases your blood flow, causes some redness in your face, and then you're like a little itchiness sometimes because it really pushes the blood out to the extremities. And Paul Stamets says that lion's mane, psilocybin, and niacin together, they're a potent combination for really changing the brain, promoting neuroplasticity, promoting this neuron growth. And the niacin it's interesting because you can really feel it. You can feel how when it comes on. And so that's part of the effect, I think, for people who do this Stamets protocol. But I've experimented with both, and I think they're both, really worthwhile.
Okay. So is it Stamets protocol?
STAMETS, stamets. Yep.
Okay. So it's using all three of those in conjunction for each of those 4 days.
Exactly.
And then the 3-day off.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And now I'm curious to look more into niacin just for circulation and things like that, because my toes and hands are always freezing. And it sounds like that could potentially hurt, just anecdotally hearing you mention that.
Potentially. Yeah. I mean, it can be a bit of an uncomfortable experience for some people. So, see how it feels like for you. For me, it's a little itchy. It causes my face to get red. But besides that, I do find it really helpful. And I like to stack it. And the reason that it's like almost counterintuitive, but Paul Stamets says that the niacin pushing the blood out to the extremities, where actually he says a lot of the neurogenesis takes place in the extremities, not just the brain, because the nervous system obviously communicates everywhere.
Okay, that makes sense.
So it's kind of mind-blowing, but that's the idea.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I really want to dig into all of this science and looking at the research of how it actually works throughout our bodies and our nervous system and all of that.
Totally. It's fascinating. So, and then I would just say also, people can experiment with their own microdosing protocols. Maybe it's just every other day for a little bit, things like that. I don't recommend, most people in this space don't recommend microdosing every day. One, because you can build a tolerance to the mushrooms and they maybe just won't be as effective for you. And also the potential risks to the heart that could be there for people who microdose for a long period of time. So, I would say it's a good idea probably to start with one of the protocols and try it for a month, see how that goes. Unless you hate it, of course.
Yeah. But if you're interested in exploring it more, give yourself 30 days to go through it, see how your body reacts to things and how it helps.
Exactly. And it is really, really helpful to just write down, like keep a journal. How do you feel before the microdose? How do you feel during the microdose? And maybe just to kind of, you can either like take an online assessment of your, mental state and well-being beforehand, or just, journal and be honest with yourself. How do I actually feel? Right. And to see if before your experimentation and then after the 30 days, if there is a difference in the way that you feel in your everyday life, the way you relate, the way, just to see if it's effective.
Mm-hmm. I'm super curious about this. I think I'm going to end up growing some and going through this.
Yeah, you'll have to share your process.
Yes, I will. So for people that are interested in this, you have already mentioned some great resources that we'll make sure are linked. But where do you recommend people go to look for more research? I know you've written some articles as well.
Yeah, I have, and not just because I write for them. Double Blind magazine is a really good resource. They're committed to good journalism. They're psychedelics advocates, but not, at the expense of sharing the negatives. They definitely share both sides of things. Very, well-considered site. So yeah, Double Blind Mag online, doubleblindmag.com is a great place for info. And they have, whole sections on psilocybin, whole sections on microdosing. I've written some of it, but not all of it. There's also, I would say, if people are interested in research, I would check out the Johns Hopkins Center that's dedicated to psychedelic studies. Also, they're doing some really interesting research right now. And MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, MAPS online. They are academics, researchers, scientists who are really seriously looking at this and compiling data and research from other places too.
Okay. Great. So we'll have that all linked for listeners that want to hear a little bit more about it.
Awesome. Right. Yeah. And then there's, tons of TED Talks and interesting things, rabbit holes to go down online. Terrence McKenna, someone that I mentioned too. And his work is interesting and, longtime psychedelics advocate. You can hear him talk about the stoned ape theory.
Yes. Yeah. Is there a TED Talk on that? Or I guess if you just Google him, you'll be able to find something.
For sure. Yeah.
Okay, neat. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of this with us. Is there anything else you would like to add?
Well, just just in general, like we have said this whole time, it's a plant medicine, but it still needs to be treated with respect. Start low and go slow. Notice, really be intentional about what you're looking for and how it makes you feel. I think that it can be a tremendous help for moms in this just really uncertain and difficult moment that we're living through. We need more emotional resilience and emotional stability and the ability to process our own grief and anxiety and trauma and all that so that we can actually parent our children in a way that doesn't recreate those traumas and anxieties. So, I think that it can be a tremendous help in this effort that you're all about. I think, promoting well-being for moms, promoting well-being for families, helping increase education, awareness, self-trust, self-love, all that good stuff.
Absolutely. Right. Well, thank you so much for taking time to share with us. Again, this was a really interesting chat. And for those listening, you can head on over to our Facebook group or group chat. I'm sure there's going to be some interesting conversations coming from this one.
Yeah, me too. Thanks so much, Janine.
Thanks. Till next time. Take care. Thank you for joining us inside the Unapologetic Moms Club. Have questions or comments about this week's episode? Feel free to bring them to our private Facebook group and group chat where we can connect and discuss things further. If this episode was helpful, please leave us a Google or Facebook review so other unapologetic moms can find our community. Every reviewer is entered to win a free month of Club. For more information and resources, visit our website at unapologeticmotherhood.com. That's it for now. You got this.